The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Millfield as Sarah Chen locked the door of her small grocery store. Her hands shook slightly as she turned the key, not from the cool October air, but from the weight of worry that had settled in her chest like a stone. Through the window she could see her 12-year-old son Tommy sitting on the wooden bench outside, his school backpack clutched tightly in his lap, his dark eyes scanning the street with the wariness of someone far older than his years. Sarah had moved to this small Texas town 3 years ago, hoping for a fresh start after her husband's death in a car accident. Millfield seemed perfect then, quiet, affordable, and far from the chaos of the city, where painful memories lurked around every corner. She used the insurance money to buy the little grocery store on Main Street, thinking it would be enough to build a new life for herself and Tommy. At first, things had gone well. The townspeople were polite, if not warm. They bought their essentials from her store, nodded when they passed her on the street, and seemed to accept their presence without much fuss. Tommy had struggled with the move, missing his friends and his father terribly, but he was a resilient child. He made a few acquaintances at school and seemed to be adjusting, but everything changed last month when the Peterson family moved back to town. Jake Peterson was 16, built like a man despite his age, with shoulders broad from working on his family's ranch, and a swagger that came from knowing his grandfather owned half the businesses in Millfield. His father had been the high school quarterback 20 years ago, and his mother came from old money. The Petersons were Millfield royalty, and Jake wore that birthright like armor. The trouble started small. Jake would make comments about Tommy's appearance, calling him weird and different. He'd knock into Tommy in the hallways, always making it look accidental. Other kids, eager to gain Jake's approval, began to follow his lead. Soon, Tommy was eating lunch alone, walking to school by himself, and coming home with grass stains on his clothes and scrapes on his knees that he claimed came from falling down. Sarah knew better. She'd seen the signs before, had experienced them herself as a child when her family first immigrated to America. The subtle exclusion, the casual cruelty. The way a community could turn against someone simply because they were different. But this was supposed to be different. This was supposed to be their safe haven. 3 days ago, things escalated beyond mere bullying. Tommy had come home with a split lip and a black eye that no amount of ice could completely hide. When Sarah pressed him for details, he finally broke down and told her what had happened. Jake Peterson had cornered him behind the school gymnasium with 3 other boys. They'd called him names that made Sarah's blood boil, words that attacked not just Tommy but their entire heritage. When Tommy tried to walk away, Jake had shoved him to the ground and kicked him twice before the others convinced him to stop. "He said I don't belong here," Tommy had whispered through his tears. "He said people like us should go back where we came from." Sarah's heart had shattered that day, not just from seeing her son hurt, but from the realization that their sanctuary had become a prison. She'd called the school the next morning, demanding a meeting with the principal. Robert Hayes was a thin, nervous man who'd held his position for 15 years by avoiding conflict whenever possible. He listened to Sarah's concerns with the appropriate expressions of sympathy, but his words rang hollow. "Boys will be boys, Mrs. Chen," he'd said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses nervously. "I'm sure it was just a misunderstanding. The Peterson boy comes from a good family. Perhaps if Tommy tried harder to fit in..." The implication was clear. The problem wasn't Jake Peterson's behavior. It was Tommy's failure to adapt. Sarah left that meeting feeling more alone than she had since her husband's funeral. Yesterday, she'd tried a different approach. She'd gone to see Sheriff Bradley Morrison, a heavy-set man with graying hair and tired eyes, who'd been keeping the peace in Millfield for over a decade. His office was small and cluttered, with wanted posters tacked to a bulletin board and a coffee pot that looked like it hadn't been cleaned since the Clinton administration. Sheriff Morrison listened to her story with what seemed like genuine concern, nodding in all the right places and making sympathetic noises. But when she finished, he leaned back in his creaky chair and sighed. "I understand your concerns, Mrs. Chen. I really do. But without witnesses or concrete proof, there's not much I can do. The Peterson family, well, they're important people in this community. George Peterson sits on the town council, and his father practically built this place. I can't go making accusations without solid evidence." Sarah had felt the walls closing in around her then, the familiar sensation of being an outsider in a place that would never truly accept her. She'd thanked the sheriff politely and left, but inside, she was screaming. Now, watching Tommy through the store window, she felt that same helpless rage building in her chest. He was trying to be brave, she could see that. He sat up straight on the bench, his chin raised defiantly, but she could also see the fear in his posture, the way he flinched every time someone walked past. The bell above the store door chimed as the morning's first customer entered. Sarah turned, forcing a smile onto her face, and found herself looking at one of the town's more mysterious residents. Everyone in Millfield knew about the man they simply called Tex, though nobody seemed to know much about him. He'd appeared in town about 6 months ago, renting the small cabin on the outskirts of town from old Mrs. Weatherby. He was tall and lean, with weathered hands that spoke of hard work and eyes the color of storm clouds. His dark hair was always hidden beneath a well-worn cowboy hat, and he moved with the quiet confidence of someone who'd seen too much of the world to be impressed by much of anything. Tex worked odd jobs around town, fixing fences, shoeing horses, helping with harvest time at the various ranches. He was reliable and skilled, completing every task with a thoroughness that impressed even the most demanding employers. But he was also intensely private. He spoke only when necessary, kept to himself, and seemed to have no interest in the town's social hierarchies or gossip networks. Some people found his silence unsettling. Others dismissed him as just another drifter who'd move on when the mood struck him. But Sarah had always found something comforting about his presence. Maybe it was the way he treated everyone with the same quiet respect, regardless of their status in town. Or maybe it was the way he'd sometimes nod to her when they passed on the street. A simple acknowledgement that somehow felt more genuine than all the forced pleasantries she received from longtime residents. "Morning, Mrs. Chen," Tex said, touching the brim of his hat politely. His voice was deep and measured, with just a hint of a southern drawl that suggested he'd traveled far to end up in Millfield. "Good morning, Tex," Sarah replied, genuine warmth creeping into her voice for the first time in days. "What can I get for you today?" He moved through the store with purpose, selecting basic supplies: coffee, beans, flour, a few vegetables. Sarah rang up his purchases, grateful for the routine nature of the interaction. It was a relief to think about something as simple as grocery inventory, instead of her mounting fears for Tommy's safety. As she bagged his items, Tex glanced toward the window where Tommy still sat on the bench. The boy was trying to read a book, but his eyes kept darting up to scan the street, and his leg bounced nervously against the bench. "Your boy seems troubled," Tex observed quietly. Sarah's hands stilled on the grocery bag. She looked at this enigmatic man, debating how much to reveal. There was something in his tone, a gentleness that she hadn't heard from anyone else in town. Maybe it was because he was an outsider, too. Or maybe it was simply exhaustion from carrying her burden alone, but she found herself speaking honestly. "He's having some difficulties at school," she said carefully. Tex nodded slowly, his gray eyes studying Tommy through the window with an intensity that made Sarah slightly uncomfortable. But there was no judgment in his gaze, only what looked like understanding. "Sometimes kids need to learn that the world's bigger than whatever corner they're stuck in," he said finally. "And sometimes they need someone to show them they're stronger than they think." Before Sarah could ask what he meant by that cryptic statement, The bell chimed again, and Mrs. Hutchins bustled into the store. The elderly woman was one of Millfield's most prolific gossips, and her arrival effectively ended any chance of private conversation. Tex tipped his hat to both women and left with his groceries, but not before giving Tommy another long look through the window. Sarah watched him walk down the street, his stride unhurried and confident, and wondered what thoughts were turning behind those storm-gray eyes. The morning passed in a blur of routine customers and mundane transactions. Sarah tried to focus on her work, but her attention kept drifting to Tommy. At 10 o'clock, she saw him stand up and adjust his backpack. School started at 8:30, which meant he was already running late. She wanted to call out to him, to tell him he could stay home today, that they could figure out another solution. But she knew that hiding wasn't the answer. Tommy needed to learn to stand up for himself, to find his place in this community, or they'd never have peace. She watched him walk down Main Street toward the school, his steps growing slower as he approached the building. Her heart ached for him, remembering her own childhood struggles with fitting in, the daily battle of proving that she belonged somewhere she wasn't entirely wanted. Around noon, Sarah was restocking shelves when she heard voices outside growing louder and more agitated. Through the window, she could see a small crowd gathering near the school playground, which was visible from Main Street. Her stomach dropped as she recognized the signs of trouble. Abandoning her work, Sarah hurried outside and down the street toward the commotion. As she got closer, she could make out individual voices, and what she heard made her blood run cold. "Look at the little freak!" Jake Peterson's voice carried clearly across the playground. "Maybe this will teach you to keep your mouth shut." Sarah pushed through the crowd of onlookers, mostly other parents who'd been picking up their children for lunch. What she saw when she reached the front made her gasp in horror and rage. Tommy was on the ground in the center of a circle formed by Jake Peterson and 4 other boys. His shirt was torn, his face was dirty, and there was blood trickling from his nose. But what shocked Sarah most was the look in her son's eyes, not fear, but a desperate, cornered determination that reminded her painfully of his father. "Get away from him!" Sarah screamed, starting toward the circle. Jake Peterson turned to look at her, his handsome face twisted into an ugly sneer. "Why don't you mind your own business, lady? We're just teaching the little immigrant a lesson about how things work around here." The casual cruelty in his voice, the way he said immigrant, like it was a disease, sent a surge of protective fury through Sarah, unlike anything she'd ever experienced. She pushed past the other boys and knelt beside Tommy, gathering him into her arms. "Please," she said, her voice breaking as she looked up at the circle of hostile young faces. "Please don't touch my son. He hasn't done anything to you." Jake laughed, a sound that held no humor. "He exists. That's enough." Sarah looked around desperately at the adult faces in the crowd. Surely someone would step in, would put a stop to this madness. But she saw only averted eyes and uncomfortable expressions. These were the same people who shopped in her store, who smiled politely when they passed her on the street. Now, faced with real conflict, they were choosing their sides, and it was clear which way the wind was blowing. "Where's a teacher?" Sarah demanded. "Why isn't anyone stopping this?" "Lunch break," Jake said with a shrug. "Besides, nobody cares about your little freak anyway." Sarah felt Tommy trembling in her arms, felt his tears soaking through her shirt, and something inside her snapped. She stood up, placing herself between her son and his tormentors, and for the first time since moving to Millfield, she let her anger show. "You listen to me, you little bully," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "My son has every right to be here, every right to feel safe at school. Your grandfather's money doesn't give you the right to hurt innocent people." Jake's face darkened. "My family built this town. We decide who belongs here and who doesn't. And we've decided about you and your weird kid." The crowd murmured, some in agreement, others in discomfort. Sarah realized with growing horror that this wasn't just about playground bullying. This was about the community itself choosing to exclude them, choosing to side with familiar cruelty over unfamiliar victims. She was about to respond when a new voice cut through the tension like a blade. "That's enough!" Everyone turned to see Tex approaching from the street. He walked with that same unhurried pace Sarah had noticed earlier, but there was something different about him now. Something in his posture, in the set of his shoulders, that made even Jake Peterson take a step backward. "This is none of your business, Drifter," Jake said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Tex stopped at the edge of the circle, his gray eyes moving slowly from face to face, taking in the scene with an intensity that made several of the boys fidget nervously. When his gaze finally settled on Jake, the teenager seemed to shrink under the weight of that stare. "When I see a child being hurt, it becomes my business," Tex said quietly. His voice carried easily across the playground, and something in its tone made the entire crowd fall silent. Sarah felt a flutter of hope mixed with confusion. Why was this mysterious stranger involving himself in their problems? What did he hope to accomplish against the combined power of the Peterson family and their supporters? Jake seemed to be wondering the same thing. He straightened his shoulders, trying to reclaim his earlier bravado. "You don't know who you're messing with, old man. My grandfather owns this town." Tex nodded slowly, as if considering this information carefully. "That's interesting," he said finally. "Tell me, boy, what exactly does your grandfather own?" The question seemed to catch Jake off guard. He gestured vaguely. "Everything. The bank, half the businesses, most of the land around here." "And what do you own?" Tex asked. Jake blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what have you built with your own hands? What have you earned through your own efforts? What gives you the right to stand here and hurt another child?" The questions hung in the air like challenges. Jake opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, clearly struggling to find an answer that didn't sound hollow. Tex took a step closer, and though his movement was casual, something about it made Jake and his friends instinctively move backward. "I've been watching you, boy," Tex said, his voice still quiet, but somehow more commanding than any shout. "I've seen how you operate, how you use your family's name like a weapon against kids who can't fight back. That tells me everything I need to know about the kind of man you're going to become." "You can't talk to me like that," Jake protested, but his voice cracked slightly. "I just did," Tex replied calmly. "Now here's what's going to happen. You're going to apologize to this boy and his mother. You're going to leave them alone from now on, and you're going to think real hard about what kind of person you want to be." Jake laughed, but it sounded forced. "Or what? You'll make me? You're just some nobody who showed up here a few months ago. You think you can tell a Peterson what to do?" Tex was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah found herself holding her breath. The entire playground had fallen silent, as if everyone sensed that something significant was happening, though they might not understand exactly what. When Tex finally spoke, his words were measured and deliberate. "Son, I've met a lot of men who thought their family name made them special. Most of them learned otherwise, usually the hard way. You're young enough that there's still time for you to choose a different path. But that choice is entirely up to you." There was something in his tone, something that suggested experiences and knowledge that went far beyond this small town and its petty hierarchies. Jake seemed to sense it too, because for the first time since Sarah had known him, the teenager looked genuinely uncertain. The standoff stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, came a new voice. "What's going on here?" Everyone turned to see Principal Hayes approaching, his face flushed from hurrying across the playground. Behind him came Sheriff Morrison, his hand resting casually on his radio as his eyes took in the scene. Sarah felt her heart sink. These were the same two men who dismissed her concerns earlier, who'd made it clear that maintaining the status quo was more important than protecting her son. Their arrival probably meant that Tex's intervention would be neutralized, that everything would go back to the way it was. But as she watched Tex turn to face the approaching authorities, she noticed something that gave her a glimmer of hope. The mysterious cowboy showed no sign of backing down or retreating. If anything, he seemed more composed than ever, as if the arrival of official authority was exactly what he'd been expecting. The confrontation was about to enter a new phase, and Sarah found herself wondering who this quiet stranger really was, and whether he truly had the power to change the outcome that had seemed so inevitable just moments before. Principal Hayes surveyed the scene with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent years managing teenage drama, but his expression grew troubled as he took in Tommy's bloodied face and torn shirt. Sheriff Morrison stood beside him, his hand still resting on his radio, his tired eyes moving from face to face in the crowd. "Mr. Peterson," Hayes addressed Jake with barely concealed nervousness. "Would you care to explain what happened here?" Jake straightened, his earlier uncertainty disappearing as he recognized friendly territory. "This guy," he pointed at Tex, "was threatening me and my friends. We were just talking to the new kid, trying to help him fit in, and this drifter started making threats." Sarah felt her stomach drop. Of course, Jake would spin the situation to his advantage. Of course, the adults would believe the Peterson boy over the evidence of their own eyes. She opened her mouth to protest, but Tex's calm voice cut through her rising panic. "That's interesting," Tex said, addressing Jake but keeping his eyes on the principal. "Tell me, son, how exactly does pushing a smaller child to the ground and making him bleed help him fit in?" Hayes shifted uncomfortably. "Now see here, Mr. Watson," Tex supplied. "Marcus Watson." Something flickered across Sheriff Morrison's face when he heard the name, a brief expression of recognition that was quickly hidden. Sarah caught it, though, and wondered what it meant. "Mr. Watson," Hayes continued, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used when dealing with difficult parents. "While I appreciate your concern for our students, this is a school matter. I'm sure we can resolve this without outside interference." "Of course," Tex agreed pleasantly. "I'm sure Mrs. Chen here would be happy to discuss how you plan to resolve the fact that her son was assaulted on school grounds during school hours." The word "assaulted" hung in the air like a thunderclap. Hayes' face went pale, and Sarah saw several parents in the crowd exchange nervous glances. In their eagerness to dismiss the incident as simple bullying, they'd overlooked the legal implications of what had actually occurred. Sheriff Morrison stepped forward. "Now hold on a minute. Let's not get carried away here. This looks like typical schoolyard roughhousing to me." Tex turned his attention to the sheriff, and Sarah noticed that his entire demeanor had subtly shifted. The quiet cowboy was still there, but underneath it was something harder, more commanding. When he spoke, his voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Sheriff Morrison, I count at least 15 witnesses to what happened here. This boy," he gestured to Tommy, "has visible injuries that will require medical attention. 5 older children surrounded one smaller child and physically assaulted him while making threats based on his ethnic background. In most jurisdictions, that would constitute assault, battery, and a hate crime." Morrison's face flushed red. "Who do you think you are, coming into my town and telling me how to do my job?" "Someone who knows the law," Tex replied simply. "Someone who's seen what happens when good people stand by and let bullies operate without consequences. Someone who's not impressed by family names or local politics." The tension in the crowd was palpable. Sarah could hear people whispering, some defending the Peterson family, others beginning to question what they'd witnessed. She tightened her arms around Tommy, who had stopped crying but was still trembling. Jake Peterson, emboldened by the presence of adult authority figures who'd always protected him before, decided to reassert himself. You think you're some kind of hero? You're nobody. My grandfather will run you out of town by tomorrow night." Tex looked at the teenager for a long moment, and Sarah saw something in his eyes that made her think of winter storms and distant thunders. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet that people leaned forward to hear him. "Son, I've been run out of better places by worse people than your grandfather, but I'm not planning on leaving Millfield anytime soon. You see, I like it here. Quiet town, decent people, good place to settle down. The only problem is bullies who think they own the place just because their granddaddy has money." He paused, letting his words sink in, then continued with devastating calm. "Now, you've got two choices. You can apologize to Mrs. Chen and her boy right now, shake hands like men, and we can put this behind us. Or we can do this the hard way." "What hard way?" Jake sneered, though Sarah noticed he stayed well within the protective circle of the adults. Tex smiled for the first time since arriving at the playground, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Well, for starters, I could file a formal complaint with the state education board about a principal who allows hate crimes on his campus. Then I could contact the FBI about civil rights violations in a federally funded school district. After that, maybe I'd reach out to some newspaper reporters who'd be very interested in a story about a small town where the sheriff refuses to investigate assaults against minority children." The color drained from Principal Hayes's face. Sheriff Morrison took a step backward. Even Jake Peterson seemed to realize that this was spinning beyond his control. Tex wasn't finished. "Of course, that's just the legal route. There's also the social media angle. Amazing how fast a video can spread these days. I bet a lot of people would be interested in seeing footage of 15 adults standing around watching a 12-year-old boy get beaten up while his mother begs for help." "You're recording this?" Hayes squeaked. Tex tapped his shirt pocket, where Sarah now noticed a small device clipped to his vest. "Body camera. Old habit. Amazing how differently people behave when they know their actions are being documented." The crowd erupted into nervous murmurs. Several parents began backing away, suddenly realizing they didn't want to be associated with what was starting to look like a very bad situation for the wrong side. Sheriff Morrison tried to regain control. "Now see here, Watson, I don't know what your game is, but you can't come into my town and start throwing around threats." "No threats, Sheriff, just consequences. Something this town seems to have forgotten how to apply evenly." Tex's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath it. "Tell me, when was the last time you arrested a Peterson? When was the last time anyone in this town held that family accountable for anything?" The question hit like a physical blow. Morrison's mouth opened and closed without sound, and Sarah saw the uncomfortable truth in his expression. The Peterson family had been operating above the law in Millfield for so long that everyone had simply accepted it as the natural order. Jake Peterson, perhaps sensing that his traditional protection was crumbling, decided to escalate. "You think you're so tough? Why don't we settle this man to man?" The words had barely left his mouth when Tex moved. It wasn't fast or dramatic, just a single fluid step that brought him within arm's reach of the teenager. Suddenly, Jake was looking up at a man who seemed to have grown several inches taller and considerably more dangerous. "Son," Tex said quietly, "you don't want to go down that road with me. Trust me on this." There was something in his tone that convinced everyone present, including Jake, that this was absolutely true. The teenager stumbled backward, his face pale with sudden understanding that he'd just challenged someone completely out of his league. Principal Hayes, sensing an opportunity to defuse the situation before it got completely out of hand, stepped between them. "Perhaps we should all calm down and discuss this rationally. Mr. Watson, I appreciate your concerns about student safety. Mrs. Chen, I assure you we take these incidents seriously. Maybe we could schedule a meeting to—" "No," Tex interrupted. "We're going to resolve this right now, right here, in front of everyone. This boy," he pointed at Jake, "is going to apologize to Mrs. Chen and her son. He's going to promise in front of all these witnesses to leave Tommy alone from now on. And you, Mr. Hayes, are going to explain exactly what disciplinary action you're taking to ensure this doesn't happen again. Hayes sputtered. I can't make those kinds of decisions without consulting the school board, without following proper procedures. Then maybe you're not qualified for your position, Tex suggested mildly. Because from where I stand, it looks like your proper procedures involve ignoring assault and battery as long as the right family is involved. Sarah watched the interplay with growing amazement. This mysterious cowboy was single-handedly dismantling the power structure that had made her and Tommy's lives miserable, and he was doing it with nothing but words, logic, and an unshakable moral authority that no one seemed able to challenge. Sheriff Morrison made one last attempt to assert control. Watson, I'm going to have to ask you to move along. You're causing a public disturbance. Tex turned to face him fully, and Sarah saw Morrison take an involuntary step backward. Sheriff, I'm going to ask you to do your job. You have witnesses to an assault. You have a victim with visible injuries. You have perpetrators who haven't denied their actions. The only thing preventing you from making arrests is politics, and that's not law enforcement, that's corruption. The word corruption hit the crowd like a slap. Several more parents began drifting away, not wanting to be associated with what was increasingly looking like a community scandal in the making. Morrison's hand moved toward his gun, and for a moment Sarah thought the situation was about to explode into violence. But Tex didn't even blink. He simply looked at the sheriff with those storm-gray eyes and waited. You really want to draw on an unarmed man in front of 15 witnesses and a body camera, Sheriff? Tex asked conversationally. Because I'm thinking that video would make for interesting viewing at your next election. Morrison's hand froze, then slowly moved away from his weapon. The defeat in his posture was visible to everyone present. Into the suddenly quiet moment, a new voice interjected. What seems to be the problem here? Everyone turned to see an elderly man approaching from the street. George Peterson, Jake's grandfather and the unofficial king of Millfield, walked with the careful dignity of someone who'd spent 70 years getting his own way. He was impeccably dressed, despite the warm afternoon, his silver hair perfectly styled, his weathered hands folded behind his back as he surveyed the scene. Sarah felt her heart sink again. George Peterson was the one person in town whose word was absolute law. If he decided to protect his grandson, then all of Tex's moral authority wouldn't matter. Money and influence would win, as they always did. Jake immediately brightened. Grandpa! This drifter has been threatening me and my friends. He made me miss lunch. And now he's trying to get me in trouble for nothing. George Peterson's pale blue eyes moved slowly across the crowd, taking in the nervous parents, the uncomfortable officials, and the defiant stranger who stood alone against the combined weight of local authority. When his gaze fell on Tommy's battered face, his expression didn't change, but something flickered deep in his eyes. Is that so? He said mildly. And what exactly is this nothing you supposedly got in trouble for? Jake hesitated, perhaps sensing a trap but not sure where it lay. We were just talking to the new kid trying to help him fit in. Then this guy started making threats and calling us criminals. George Peterson looked at his grandson for a long moment, then shifted his attention to Tex. And you are? Marcus Watson, Tex replied, offering neither deference nor challenge, simply stating a fact. And what's your interest in this situation, Mr. Watson? Tex gestured toward Tommy and Sarah. I don't like seeing children hurt. I especially don't like seeing them hurt while adults stand around making excuses for the people doing the hurting. George Peterson nodded slowly. I see. And you believe my grandson hurt this boy? I know he did. So does everyone else here, including you. The blunt honesty of the statement created a ripple of shock through the crowd. No one talked to George Peterson that way. No one challenged the Peterson family patriarch in public. It simply wasn't done. But George Peterson didn't explode or threaten. Instead, he studied Tex with the calculating gaze of someone who'd built an empire by accurately judging people's capabilities and motivations. After a long moment, he turned to his grandson. "Jake, show me your hands." "What?" Jake blinked, confused. "Your hands, boy. Hold them out." Jake reluctantly extended his hands. George Peterson examined them carefully, noting the scraped knuckles and the traces of dirt and blood. "Interesting," the old man mused. "For someone who was just talking, you seem to have gotten into quite a scuffle." He looked at Tommy's face again, then back at his grandson. "Son, I've been around long enough to recognize the signs of a fight. The question is whether you were defending yourself or picking on someone smaller than you." Jake's confidence began to waver. "Grandpa, because if you were picking on someone smaller, someone who couldn't fight back, then you've brought shame on our family name. And that's something I won't tolerate from anyone, including my own blood." Sarah stared in shock. This was not the response she'd expected from the Peterson family patriarch. Around her, she could see similar surprise on the faces of the other onlookers. George Peterson turned his attention back to Tex. "Mr. Watson, you seem like a man who speaks plainly. Tell me what you saw." Tex met the old man's gaze steadily. "I saw 5 boys surround one smaller boy and beat him while his mother begged them to stop. I saw a crowd of adults watch it happen without intervening. I saw school officials and a sheriff more concerned with protecting the attackers than helping the victim. And I saw a community that's forgotten the difference between right and wrong." The words hung in the air like an indictment. George Peterson absorbed them without flinching, then looked around at the assembled crowd as if seeing them clearly for the first time. "Mrs. Chen," he said, addressing Sarah directly, "I believe I owe you and your son an apology. It appears that our community has failed you badly." Sarah was so shocked she couldn't speak. Of all the possible outcomes she'd imagined, this wasn't one of them. George Peterson turned to his grandson, and his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "Jake, you will apologize to Mrs. Chen and her son. You will mean it. And you will never, ever raise a hand against another child again. Do I make myself clear?" Jake looked around desperately for support, but found only hostile or averted gazes. Even his friends had begun to distance themselves, sensing which way the wind was blowing. "But Grandpa, he's different. He doesn't belong." "He belongs here as much as anyone else," George Peterson cut him off sharply. "This is America, boy. People don't have to meet your approval to belong here. They don't have to look like you or talk like you or think like you. They just have to be decent human beings, which is apparently more than I can say for you right now." The rebuke was delivered with such finality that Jake seemed to physically shrink. Sarah watched as the bully who'd terrorized her son was reduced to a frightened child in front of his grandfather's disappointment. "Now apologize," George Peterson commanded. "And then you're going to think very hard about what kind of man you want to become, because the one you're turning into isn't worthy of the Peterson name." Jake looked around one more time, saw no rescue coming, and reluctantly approached Sarah and Tommy. His apology was mumbled and clearly forced, but it was an apology nonetheless. When he was finished, he retreated to his grandfather's side, looking thoroughly chastened. George Peterson wasn't done. He turned to Principal Hayes and Sheriff Morrison with the same steely authority he'd used on his grandson. "Gentlemen, it seems to me that this situation has revealed some serious problems with how this community handles conflicts. I suggest you both think carefully about how to fix those problems, because I'll be watching to make sure they don't happen again." The threat was politely phrased but unmistakably real. Both men nodded quickly, eager to avoid further humiliation. Finally, George Peterson turned back to Tex. "Mr. Watson, I'm curious about something. You're new to town. You have no personal stake in this family's problems, and you just challenged some very powerful people to help a child you barely know. That takes either courage or foolishness, and you don't strike me as a foolish man." Tex shrugged. "Sometimes the right thing to do is obvious. Doesn't matter if it's convenient or not." "Indeed." George Peterson studied him for another moment. "Tell me, what do you do for work?" "Whatever needs doing," Tex replied. "Fix fences, shoe horses, help with harvests. I'm not particular as long as the work's honest." George Peterson nodded thoughtfully. "I may have some work for you, if you're interested. Projects that require a man who's not afraid to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult." Sarah realized that something significant was happening, though she wasn't entirely sure what. The community's power structure had just been dramatically reshuffled, and somehow the quiet cowboy who'd wandered into their lives was at the center of it all. As the crowd began to disperse, many of the parents approached Sarah to offer awkward apologies and assurances that they'd had no idea things had gotten so bad. Their sudden friendliness felt hollow, but Sarah accepted their words graciously, recognizing that change had to start somewhere. Tommy, meanwhile, had perked up considerably. The transformation in his posture was remarkable, from the frightened, hunched child of that morning to someone who stood a little taller, looked people in the eye, and seemed to remember that he had every right to be exactly where he was. As they prepared to leave the playground, Tex approached them one final time. "Mrs. Chen, if you don't mind me saying so, you've got a brave son. Standing up to bullies when you're outnumbered takes real courage." Tommy looked up at him with something approaching hero worship. "Were you really going to fight all of them?" Tex chuckled, the first time Sarah had seen him display anything approaching humor. "Sometimes the threat of a fight is more powerful than the fight itself. But yes, son, if it had come to that, I would have done whatever was necessary to keep you safe." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I don't know how to repay what you've done for us." "No need," Tex replied. "Just raise that boy to be a good man. The world needs more of those." As they walked back toward the store, Sarah reflected on the day's events with a mixture of relief and bewilderment. In the space of a few hours, their lives had been transformed from a nightmare of helplessness to something that looked remarkably like hope. But she also sensed that today was just the beginning. The real work of rebuilding Tommy's confidence, of establishing their place in the community, of ensuring that the changes would last. That would take time. And she had the feeling that Marcus Watson, the mysterious cowboy who'd appeared in their lives like an answer to a prayer, would be central to whatever came next. The reserved stranger had indeed begun to transform their outcome, but Sarah suspected the most important changes were still to come. 3 weeks later, Sarah stood in her grocery store watching the afternoon sun slant through the windows, painting everything in golden hues that seemed to promise better times ahead. The change in her life since that day on the playground had been so dramatic that sometimes she wondered if she'd dreamed the whole thing. Tommy burst through the door, his face flushed from running, but wearing a grin that had become increasingly common since the confrontation with Jake Peterson. Behind him came 2 other children, Maria Santos, whose family ran the town's Mexican restaurant, and David Kim, whose parents owned the hardware store. The 3 had become inseparable friends, bonded by their shared status as outsiders who'd found acceptance. "Mom, can we have sodas?" Tommy asked, still breathing hard from their race down Main Street. "Mr. Watson said we could take a break from fence work if we helped him finish the north pasture." Sarah smiled, reaching for 3 bottles from the cooler. Over the past weeks, Tommy had spent most of his free time with Marcus Watson, learning everything from proper knot tying to basic carpentry. The quiet cowboy had become an unofficial mentor to several of the town's children, particularly those who'd felt excluded from Millfield's social circles. "How's the fence coming along?" Sarah asked, handing out the cold drinks. "Great," David chimed in. Mr. Watson says we're natural workers. He's teaching us how to use real tools, not kid stuff. Maria nodded enthusiastically. And he tells the best stories while we work. Yesterday he told us about tracking cattle rustlers through a canyon in Arizona. Sarah had heard fragments of these stories, each one offering tantalizing glimpses into Marcus Watson's past. Tales of working cattle drives through Colorado, of breaking horses in Montana, of helping a sheriff track down bank robbers in New Mexico. The stories were told casually, almost dismissively, but they painted a picture of a man who'd lived a full and adventurous life long before arriving in Millfield. The children grabbed their sodas and headed back outside, chattering excitedly about their afternoon's work. Sarah watched them go with a warmth in her chest that had become familiar. Tommy was a different child than he'd been a month ago, confident, outgoing, eager to try new things. The transformation was remarkable. The bell above the door chimed again, and George Peterson entered. Sarah's relationship with the town's most influential resident had evolved considerably since that day on the playground. He'd made a point of shopping at her store regularly, and his obvious approval had opened doors throughout the community that had previously remained firmly closed. "Afternoon, Mrs. Chen," he said, tipping his hat politely. "How are things today?" "Very well, thank you, Mr. Peterson. What can I get for you?" He moved through the store with the deliberate pace of a man who'd learned to make every action count. As he selected his items, he spoke casually about town affairs. But Sarah had learned to listen carefully to his seemingly offhand comments. George Peterson never said anything without purpose. "Heard Marcus has been working on my north fence line," he mentioned while examining a display of canned goods. "Boy's doing excellent work. Haven't seen craftsmanship like that in years." "Tommy enjoys helping him," Sarah replied carefully. She'd learned that discussions of Marcus Watson required delicacy. The Cowboy's past remained largely mysterious, but George Peterson clearly knew more about it than he was saying. "Marcus is a good influence on the children," Peterson continued. "Teaches them skills they'll need, values that matter. We're lucky to have him in town." The comment carried weight beyond its simple words. Coming from George Peterson, it was tantamount to an official endorsement, a signal to the community that Marcus Watson was under his protection. Peterson finished his shopping and approached the counter to pay. As Sarah rang up his purchases, he studied her with those calculating pale blue eyes. "Mrs. Chen, I've been meaning to ask you something. How would you feel about expanding your business?" Sarah blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift in topic. "Expanding?" "The old bakery 2 doors down has been empty for 6 months. Owner moved to Dallas, couldn't find a buyer. Building's in good shape, reasonable rent. I was thinking it might make a nice addition to a grocery operation. Fresh bread, pastries, maybe a small cafe area." Sarah's mind raced. The suggestion was tantalizing but also terrifying. She'd barely gotten the grocery store stable, and expanding would require capital she didn't have and skills she wasn't sure she possessed. Peterson seemed to read her thoughts. "Of course, any expansion would require capital investment. I might be willing to discuss a partnership arrangement if you were interested. Silent partner, purely financial. You'd maintain full operational control." The offer was generous beyond anything Sarah had dared hope for. It was also clearly connected to the events of 3 weeks ago, part of George Peterson's apparent campaign to integrate her family fully into Millfield's community structure. "That's very generous," she said carefully. "But I'd need to think about it, maybe discuss it with Marcus," Peterson finished with a knowing smile. "Good idea. Man's got a solid head for business along with everything else. Take your time with the decision, Mrs. Chen. Opportunity will be there when you're ready." After Peterson left, Sarah found herself staring out the window toward the Peterson ranch, where she could see tiny figures working on the fence line in the distance. Marcus Watson had become central to their lives in ways she was still trying to understand. He was Tommy's mentor, her advisor, and increasingly, something that felt dangerously close to family. The mystery of his background had deepened over the weeks rather than clarified. George Peterson's obvious respect for him suggested a history that went far beyond simple ranch work. Sheriff Morrison, once antagonistic, now treated Marcus with the careful deference usually reserved for judges or federal agents. Even Principal Hayes had undergone a complete transformation, implementing new anti-bullying policies and treating Sarah with a respect that bordered on nervousness. But it was the smaller changes that meant the most to Sarah. The way people greeted her on the street with genuine warmth instead of polite indifference. The way other parents invited Tommy to birthday parties and playdates. The way she'd begun to feel like Millfield might actually become home instead of just a place where she and Tommy existed on the margins. As afternoon gave way to evening, Sarah closed the store and walked toward the Peterson ranch to collect Tommy. The fence work had become a daily routine, and she'd taken to timing her arrival for the end of the workday, partly to ensure Tommy didn't overstay his welcome, and partly because she'd come to treasure these brief conversations with Marcus. She found them finishing up for the day, 3 children and 1 cowboy, putting tools away with the methodical care that Marcus insisted upon. Everything had its place. Everything was cleaned and properly stored. It was a lesson in responsibility that went far beyond simple fence repair. "Mom," Tommy called out when he spotted her approaching, "come look at what we finished today." He led her to a section of fence that gleamed with fresh wire and new posts. The craftsmanship was immediately obvious. Straight lines, tight wire, posts set to exactly the right depth. It was work that would last for decades. Marcus approached, removing his work gloves and tucking them into his belt. 3 weeks of working together had made him slightly less reserved around Sarah, though he remained a man of few words. "Boy's got real talent for this kind of work," he said, watching Tommy demonstrate the proper technique for tightening fence wire to Maria and David. "Patient, careful, takes pride in doing things right. Those are rare qualities." "He's learned more in the past 3 weeks than in the past 3 years, Sarah replied. "I can't thank you enough for the time you've spent with him." Marcus shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude as always. Kid needed someone to believe in him. Amazing what children can accomplish when they know someone expects the best from them. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the 3 children work together with the easy camaraderie that had replaced their earlier isolation. The change in all of them was remarkable, but particularly in Tommy. The scared, withdrawn boy who'd sat trembling on the store bench was gone, replaced by someone confident and capable. "Marcus," Sarah said carefully, "can I ask you something?" He nodded, his storm-gray eyes patient and attentive. "That day on the playground, when you stood up to Jake Peterson and the others, why did you do it? You barely knew us, you had nothing to gain. Most people would have walked away." Marcus was quiet for a long time, his gaze distant as if he were seeing something beyond the immediate landscape. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested painful memories. "I had a son once," he said simply. "About Tommy's age when I lost him. Car accident, drunk driver. Nothing I could do to stop it. Nothing I could do to save him." Sarah felt her breath catch. She'd suspected there was tragedy in Marcus's past. But hearing it confirmed still hit her like a physical blow. Marcus continued, his voice steady but distant. "For a long time after that, I couldn't see past my own pain. Drifted around the country, taking whatever work I could find, not caring much about anything or anyone. Figured the world was just a cruel place and there wasn't any point in trying to make it better." He paused, watching Tommy laugh at something David had said. "But eventually I realized that running away from pain doesn't make it go away. It just means the pain doesn't serve any purpose. So I started looking for ways to make it mean something." "And Tommy?" When I saw him on that playground, surrounded by those boys while adults stood around doing nothing, it was like looking at every injustice I'd ever walked away from. Every time I'd chosen to mind my own business instead of helping someone who needed it. I couldn't save my son, but maybe I could save yours. The honesty of the admission left Sarah speechless. She'd known that Marcus's intervention had been motivated by more than simple civic duty, but understanding the depth of his pain and the way he'd chosen to transform it into purpose gave her a new appreciation for the man's character. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "About your son." Marcus nodded, accepting her condolence with the same calm grace he brought to everything else. "Thank you. He was a good boy. Would have liked Tommy, I think. They had the same curiosity about how things work, the same willingness to try new things." As if summoned by their conversation, Tommy approached with dirt on his clothes and satisfaction written across his face. "Mr. Watson, are we going to work on the gate tomorrow?" he asked eagerly. "If your mother doesn't mind," Marcus replied. "Gates are tricky. Need someone with patience and good hands to get them right." Tommy beamed at the implied compliment. "Mom, can I, please? Mr. Watson says I'm almost ready to learn about hinges and hardware." Sarah smiled at her son's enthusiasm. "Of course, if Mr. Watson has time for you." "Always have time for good help," Marcus said seriously, and Sarah saw Tommy straighten with pride at being considered valuable. As they prepared to leave, George Peterson's truck pulled up to the fence line. The elderly patriarch climbed out slowly, his movements careful but still purposeful. "How's the fence coming, Marcus?" he called. "Be finished by end of week," Marcus replied. "These three have been excellent helpers." Peterson approached, examining the work with a critical eye that missed nothing. After a thorough inspection, he nodded approvingly. "Fine craftsmanship. Haven't seen work this good since my father's time." He turned to the children. "You youngsters should be proud. This fence will outlast all of us." The children glowed under his praise, but Peterson's attention shifted to Marcus. "Marcus, could I have a word?" The two men walked a short distance away, their voices too low for Sarah to hear the conversation. She watched their body language, noting the obvious respect Peterson showed for Marcus's opinions. Whatever they were discussing seemed serious and involved several pointing gestures toward different parts of the ranch. When they returned, Peterson was smiling. "Marcus, I've got a proposition for you. Been thinking about this for a while, and after seeing the quality of your work, I'm convinced it's the right move." "What kind of proposition?" Marcus asked cautiously. "Ranch foreman position, full-time, permanent. Comes with a house on the property, good salary, benefits. Position's been empty since Frank Morrison retired last year. Haven't found anyone with the right combination of skills and character until now." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. A permanent position would mean Marcus was staying in Millfield indefinitely. It would also mean a significant change in his status within the community. Ranch foreman for the Peterson spread was a position of considerable respect and influence. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering the offer. "That's generous, Mr. Peterson. But I should mention that I'm not just a ranch hand. My background is more complicated than that." Peterson chuckled. "Son, I know exactly who you are. Took me about 2 days after you arrived to make some phone calls and find out. Retired Texas Ranger, 20-year career, citations for valor, expert in criminal investigation and community relations. Took early retirement after personal tragedy, but maintained your peace officer certification." Sarah stared at Marcus in shock. A Texas Ranger. That explained so much. The quiet authority, the way he'd handled the confrontation on the playground, the respect he commanded from people like Sheriff Morrison, who would normally resent outside interference. Marcus met her surprised gaze with a rueful smile. "Probably should have mentioned that earlier." "You think?" Sarah said weakly, her mind reeling with this new information. Peterson continued, clearly enjoying the revelation. Point is, Marcus, I know what kind of man you are. The kind who spent 20 years protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. The kind who retired not because he stopped caring, but because personal loss made it too hard to keep doing the work. The kind who came to a small town looking for peace but couldn't help himself when he saw injustice happening. Marcus looked uncomfortable with the praise, but didn't deny its accuracy. That still doesn't explain why you'd want me as foreman. Because this ranch needs more than just someone who can manage cattle and fix fences, Peterson replied. It needs someone who understands leadership, who can make good decisions under pressure, who has the respect of the community. You've already proven you're all of those things. Tommy, who had been listening to the adult conversation with growing excitement, suddenly burst out with the question Sarah was afraid to ask. Does this mean you're staying? For real? Marcus looked down at the boy who'd become so important to him, then at Sarah, who was trying to keep her expression neutral despite the hope blooming in her chest. If I took this job, Marcus said slowly, I'd be staying for the long haul. No more drifting, no more moving on when things get complicated. Is that something you'd want? Yes, Tommy exclaimed without hesitation. Please stay, Mr. Watson. Everything's better when you're here. Marcus looked at Sarah questioningly, and she saw in his eyes the same hope and uncertainty she felt. 3 weeks ago, they'd been strangers. Now the thought of him leaving felt like losing family. Tommy's right, she said simply. Everything is better when you're here. Something in Marcus's expression shifted, a tension she hadn't realized he'd been carrying, finally releasing. Then I guess I'm staying, he said, extending his hand to George Peterson. I'd be honored to accept the position, Mr. Peterson. As the two men shook hands, Sarah felt a wave of relief and joy so intense it left her almost dizzy. Marcus was staying. Tommy would continue to have his mentor and father figure. She would continue to have the steady, reliable presence that had become so central to her sense of security and belonging. But more than that, she realized as she watched Tommy practically bouncing with excitement, this represented something even more significant. They weren't just gaining a friend or even a protector. They were gaining family, the kind of chosen family that sometimes meant more than blood relations because it was based on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine caring. The weeks that followed brought a steady stream of positive changes to Millfield. Marcus's new position as Peterson Ranch foreman carried significant influence, which he used quietly but effectively to promote fairness and inclusion throughout the community. Children who had previously been marginalized found themselves welcomed into activities and groups. Parents who had once ignored problems began addressing them proactively. Jake Peterson underwent his own transformation, guided by his grandfather's firm hand and Marcus's patient mentoring. The angry, entitled teenager gradually became someone capable of genuine remorse and positive action. He never became Tommy's friend. Some wounds took time to heal, but he became someone who actively worked to prevent other children from experiencing the bullying he'd once inflicted. Sarah's grocery store thrived, eventually expanding into the bakery space as George Peterson had suggested. The combination grocery cafe became a natural gathering place for the community, somewhere people came not just to shop but to connect with their neighbors. Sarah found herself at the center of Millfield's social network, valued for her opinions and trusted with confidences. Most importantly, Tommy continued to flourish under Marcus's guidance. The frightened, isolated child became a confident young man with strong values and practical skills. He learned not just how to work with his hands, but how to treat people with respect, regardless of their background or status. And Sarah learned something she'd thought was lost forever, that home wasn't just a place, but a feeling, a sense of belonging, of being valued, of being part of something larger than yourself. She'd found that feeling in Millfield, not because the town was perfect, but because one quiet, damaged man had refused to walk away when doing the right thing was difficult. On warm evenings, she would sometimes stand on the porch of her small house and look out toward the Peterson ranch, where lights glowed in the windows of the foreman's house where Marcus now lived. Tommy would often be there, working on some project or just talking with the man who'd become the father he'd lost too young. Those moments reminded Sarah that sometimes the most profound changes in life came not from dramatic gestures or grand plans, but from simple decisions to care about others, to stand up for what was right, to refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. Marcus Watson had transformed their outcome not through violence or dramatic confrontation, but through the quiet application of moral courage and unwavering principle. He'd shown a community that change was possible, that people could choose to be better, that standing up for others was not just the right thing to do, but the necessary thing. The reserved cowboy had indeed changed everything, not just for Tommy and Sarah, but for an entire town that had forgotten what it meant to be a true community. In saving a frightened boy from bullies, he'd saved himself from a life of purposeless drifting, and in the process, he'd given all of them something precious, the knowledge that family could be chosen, that home could be built, and that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with guns or fists, but with courage, compassion, and an unshakable belief that every person deserved dignity and respect. Years later, when Tommy was grown and had children of his own, he would tell them the story of the quiet stranger who'd changed their lives with nothing more than a willingness to do what was right. And those children would carry forward the lesson Marcus Watson had taught their father, that true strength lay not in overpowering others, but in protecting them, and that the measure of a person wasn't their family name or wealth or position, but their character and the way they treated those who couldn't defend themselves. The reserved cowboy's greatest transformation of all was proving that one person, standing up at the right moment for the right reasons, could change not just an outcome, but an entire community's understanding of what was possible when people chose courage over comfort, justice over convenience, and love over fear.